She took the box from my hands. It was heavy, wrapped in the silver paper I knew my son liked, the same paper I'd used for his birthday gifts since he was 12 years old. For a moment, I thought she was just being helpful, reaching out to take the weight from my 71-year-old arms. But then her fingers closed around it like a trap, and she pulled it toward herself, away from me. "Thank you," she said, her voice like winter air cutting through the warmth of the celebration behind her. "But we don't want you here." She didn't even look at me as she said it. Her eyes were fixed somewhere over my shoulder into the noise of the party I wasn't allowed to join, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the voices of people celebrating my son Mark's 10th wedding anniversary. An anniversary I had helped plan, just like I'd helped plan their wedding. An anniversary where my own presence had somehow become unwelcome. If you're listening to this story, please subscribe to this channel. I need to know. Have you ever held out a piece of your heart only to have it taken and treated like trash? Have you ever stood on someone's doorstep with love in your hands only to be told that love was a burden? Because that's exactly what happened to me on a Saturday evening in October when I drove across town carrying the most meaningful gift I'd ever created, 3 months of painstaking work, every page a labor of love, only to have my daughter-in-law Sarah take it from my hands and shut the door in my face. That box contained a restored vintage photo album filled with pictures of my son's childhood. Not just any pictures, the irreplaceable ones. Mark taking his first steps in our old kitchen, his gap-toothed grin on his first day of school. The Christmas morning when he was 6 and hugged me so tight I thought my ribs might crack, whispering, "Thank you, Mama," in my ear like it was a secret meant just for us. I had spent months tracking down the original photos from relatives, scanning them, having them professionally restored where the colors had faded. I'd researched the perfect album, acid-free pages, archival quality, the kind that would preserve these memories for generations. Each page was arranged chronologically, with little notes in my careful handwriting. Mark's first baseball game. He struck out but wouldn't stop smiling. The day he learned to ride his bike. 3 scraped knees and pure determination. It was supposed to be a bridge, a peace offering, a way to remind them both of the love that had built the foundation of the man they were celebrating. Instead, Sarah stood in that doorway wearing a dress I had never seen before, emerald green silk that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and looked at me like I was a stranger selling something she didn't want. The warm light from their beautiful home spilled out around her, framing her in golden warmth while I stood in the cool darkness of their front porch, suddenly feeling every one of my 71 years. "We don't want you here." 5 words, 23 letters, 1 sentence that sliced through 36 years of motherhood, 10 years of trying to be the mother-in-law she wanted, and a lifetime of believing that love would always find a way. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, my mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Behind Sarah, I could see glimpses of the party. My son's colleagues, her family members, friends I recognized but who weren't looking in my direction. The dining room table I had helped them pick out was set with the good china, covered with food I hadn't been asked to bring. "But Mark," I started to say, thinking surely there had been some mistake, some miscommunication. Surely my son, the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, didn't know his mother was being turned away from his celebration. Mark agrees," Sarah said, still not meeting my eyes. "We've talked about this." And then, as if she was doing me a favor, she added, "The gift is lovely though, thank you." The door closed with a soft click, not a slam, that would have been honest anger, just a quiet, final sound that said I was no longer part of the story they were telling about their life together. I stood on that porch for another full minute, staring at the closed door, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration on the other side. Laughter, music, the life my son was living without me. The warm, yellow light from their windows fell across their perfectly manicured lawn, but none of it reached where I was standing. And then I walked back to my car, The same car Mark had helped me pick out 3 years ago when he still called me every Sunday and asked my opinion about things that mattered. I got behind the wheel with empty hands and an emptier heart, and I drove home, through streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar, even though I'd lived in this town for 40 years. The drive home was 15 minutes of absolute silence. No radio, no phone calls, no tears. Just the hum of my engine and the sound of my world quietly falling apart. I kept my hands steady on the wheel and my eyes on the road, because if I let myself think about what had just happened, I might have driven straight into the river. But I didn't drive into the river. I drove home to my empty house, where I was about to learn the difference between being alone and being lonely, and discover that sometimes the person who saves you is yourself. You have to understand, this wasn't supposed to be how the story went. 10 years ago, I was the mother of the groom, standing in the back of St. Mary's Cathedral, watching my son Mark marry the woman he'd chosen to spend his life with. I wore navy blue silk because Sarah had specifically requested that the mothers avoid wearing anything too attention-grabbing. I remember thinking how considerate that was, how it showed she understood the delicate balance of wedding day politics. Sarah looked stunning that day, genuinely radiant in a way that made me understand why my son had fallen so completely in love with her. During the reception, she hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for raising such an incredible man." I felt like I was gaining a daughter, not losing a son. I felt like our family was expanding, growing stronger. But looking back now, I can see the signs I chose to ignore. Even then, Sarah had opinions about everything. The flowers I'd suggested were too traditional. The reception venue Mark initially wanted was not quite right for our vision. She never said no directly, never created outright conflict. She just had a way of making her preferences feel like natural conclusions, inevitable choices that everyone could agree were obviously better. Mark started changing almost immediately after they got engaged. Not dramatically. It was like watching someone slowly adjust the temperature in a room. Phone calls that used to happen every Sunday became every other Sunday, then monthly, then only when there was something specific to discuss. Our long conversations about books, politics, his work, his dreams gradually shortened into efficient exchanges of information. The photo album I spent 3 months creating wasn't just a gift. It was a desperate attempt to remind them both of who we used to be before Sarah's vision of their perfect life began excluding me from the picture. I had started working on it in July, right after their anniversary invitation arrived in the mail. Not handed to me personally, not mentioned in a phone call, mailed, like I was a distant relative they felt obligated to include. I drove to 3 different antique shops to find the perfect album. Leather-bound, with thick cream pages and those little photo corners that hold pictures without damaging them. I spent hours in my dining room with magnifying glasses and cotton gloves, carefully removing decades-old photos from their original albums, some so delicate they threatened to crumble at my touch. There was the photo of Mark at 18 months, chocolate cake smeared across his face at his first birthday party, his tiny hands reaching for more. The picture of him at 7, missing his 2 front teeth, proudly holding up the fish we caught on our weekend camping trip. Just the 2 of us because his father had to work. The high school graduation photo where he's looking right at the camera with such hope, such certainty that the world was waiting for him to make his mark on it. Each photograph was a conversation I wanted to have with them. Remember this, I was trying to say. Remember when I was the person he ran to when he was hurt, when I was the one who knew exactly how to make him laugh when he was sad. Remember when my love was welcome, when my presence was a comfort instead of an inconvenience. But even as I worked on that album, I was fighting a growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. Sarah had started making comments, never cruel, always wrapped in concern or practicality, about my outdated decorating style, my old-fashioned cooking methods, my traditional approach to child-rearing when they started having children. Mark's mother has such interesting ideas about discipline, she'd say to friends at family gatherings, her tone suggesting that interesting was not necessarily good. She comes from a different generation, you know. Things were simpler then. Mark never disagreed with these assessments. He never defended me or suggested that maybe different didn't mean wrong. He would just nod thoughtfully, as if Sarah was helping him understand something about his own upbringing that he'd been too close to see clearly. The grandchildren, Emma, now 8, and little James, 5, had become the battlefield where this subtle war was being fought. Visits that used to be spontaneous became scheduled, then supervised, then increasingly rare. "The kids have such busy schedules now," Sarah would explain. "Soccer and piano and play dates, you know how it is." But I didn't know how it was because no one was telling me what the schedules were. I'd call to ask about Emma's recital or James's baseball game, only to learn they had already happened. "Oh, didn't Mark mention it?" Sarah would say, her voice genuinely surprised. "I thought he'd called you." The financial requests started small and seemed reasonable. Could I help with the deposit for their first house? Of course. I was thrilled to contribute to their future. Could I loan them money for Sarah's graduate program? Absolutely. Education was an investment in their family's success. The honeymoon they couldn't quite afford but desperately needed after the stress of wedding planning? What mother wouldn't want her son to start his marriage with beautiful memories? But loans, I learned, was not the right word for what was happening. These were gifts I was expected to give graciously and never mention again. When I gently brought up repayment schedules, or even just acknowledgement of what I'd contributed, Sarah would get a wounded look and Mark would change the subject with obvious discomfort. "Mom's keeping track," I overheard Mark say to Sarah once when I was visiting, his tone carrying a judgment that cut through me like a blade, as if wanting some recognition for the sacrifices I was making was petty and small-minded, as if love should be measured by how willing you are to be forgotten. So I stopped keeping track, at least out loud. I swallowed my pride and convinced myself that this was what mature love looked like: giving without expectation, supporting without recognition, loving without conditions. I told myself that Sarah's dismissive comments came from insecurity, that Mark's increasing distance was just the natural result of building his own family. The night before their anniversary party, I spent 2 hours getting ready. I tried on 3 different dresses, finally settling on the blue one Mark had complimented years ago. I did my hair at the salon and bought new earrings, small pearls that wouldn't draw attention, but showed I had made an effort. I wrapped that photo album in silver paper with a cream-colored ribbon, writing their names on the card in my best handwriting. Driving to their house that evening, I actually felt optimistic for the first time in months. This gift would remind them of our shared history, our family bonds, the love that had created the foundation for everything good in Mark's life. Sarah would see those pictures of her husband as a boy and remember that I was the one who had shaped him into the man she fell in love with. I was so convinced that love would win, that history would matter, that the mother who had given everything would finally be seen and appreciated. I carried that beautiful, heavy box to their front door like I was carrying hope itself. I had no idea I was walking into my own execution. The drive home was 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours. I kept my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, my back straight, my eyes focused on the familiar streets that suddenly seemed foreign. The weight of that rejected gift was gone from my passenger seat, but something heavier had taken its place. The crushing realization that I had been living in a delusion. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for several minutes, engine off, listening to the tick of cooling metal. My porch light was on. I'd left it burning for my return, expecting to come home with stories of laughter and celebration, maybe carrying leftover cake or a plate Sarah had insisted I take. Instead, I was returning with empty hands and a heart that felt like it had been surgically removed. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the silence of my house. Not the comfortable quiet of solitude, but the echoing emptiness of abandonment. The hallway mirror reflected back a woman I barely recognized, perfectly dressed for a party she'd been ejected from, still wearing the hopeful expression of someone who expected to be welcomed. I walked straight to my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd wrapped that gift with such care just hours before. The silver wrapping paper scraps were still in the wastebasket, along with the ribbon I'd cut too short on my first attempt. evidence of hope now transformed into monuments to my own stupidity. I filled my electric kettle with water, selected a tea bag from the box Mark had given me last Christmas, Earl Grey, my favorite, though I wondered now if he'd remembered that or if Sarah had told him what to buy. I stood at my kitchen counter, waiting for the water to boil, my hands resting on the granite surface I'd saved for 2 years to afford. The heat from the mug was the only warmth I could feel. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Mark used to do his homework, while I cooked dinner, where we'd played countless games of Scrabble on rainy Sunday afternoons, where I'd helped him write his college application essays, and I let myself truly absorb what had happened. This wasn't a moment of anger. Sarah hadn't lost her temper or said something in the heat of emotion that she might later regret. Her rejection had been calm, deliberate, practiced. The way she avoided eye contact, the way she positioned herself in the doorway to block my view of the party, these weren't spontaneous actions. They were the execution of a plan. "We've talked about this," she had said. We. Not "I've decided" or "I think it's best." We. Which meant that somewhere at some point my son and his wife had sat down and discussed the problem of my presence in their lives. They had weighed the pros and cons of including me in their anniversary celebration and concluded that the cons outweighed the pros. I thought about the invitation that had arrived by mail instead of being mentioned in a phone call. I thought about how it had been addressed to Mrs. Margaret Stevens, in handwriting I didn't recognize, probably Sarah's, formal and distant. Not Mom or Margaret or even Mark's mother, just the full name on an envelope, like I was a business acquaintance or a distant relative they felt obligated to acknowledge. The tea grew cold in my hands as I sat there piecing together the evidence I'd been too hopeful to see clearly. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision made at their front door. This had been planned, discussed, agreed upon. They had expected me to come, and they had decided in advance how they would handle my unwelcome presence. The gift. My 3 months of careful work, my attempt to bridge whatever gap had grown between us, had probably been anticipated too. They knew I would bring something meaningful, something that demonstrated my love and investment in their family, and they had decided in advance that whatever I brought would be accepted, but that I would not be. I looked around my kitchen, really seeing it for the first time in months. The refrigerator covered with outdated photos of Emma and James, school pictures from 2 years ago because I hadn't been given the most recent ones, the calendar on my wall with their birthdays marked in red ink, though I'd learned about their last birthday parties after they'd already happened, the cookbook Sarah had given me for my birthday last year, still pristine because she'd never asked for any of the recipes inside. This house had become a shrine to a relationship that no longer existed. I had been maintaining the fiction of being a welcome grandmother, a valued mother-in-law, a cherished family member, while they had moved on without me months or maybe even years ago. The phone rang at exactly 9:30, startling me out of my dark reverie. Mark's name appeared on the caller ID, and for one pathetic moment, my heart leaped with the hope that he was calling to apologize, to explain that there had been some terrible misunderstanding, to invite me back to the party. But when I answered, his voice carried no warmth, no regret, only the careful tone of someone who was about to explain why I was wrong to feel hurt by something that was perfectly reasonable. "Mom," he said, and I could hear the forced patience in that single word. "Sarah told me what happened tonight. I think we need to have a conversation about boundaries." Boundaries. Not, "I'm sorry you were hurt," or "we handled that badly," or even, "let me explain what happened." Boundaries. As if I was the problem that needed to be managed, not the mother who had just been publicly rejected by her own family. "What boundaries would those be, Mark?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "You can't just show up expecting to be included in everything. We're adults with our own lives, our own friends, our own way of doing things. Tonight was about us, not about making sure everyone else felt included." Everyone else. Not you, not Mom, not even my mother. Everyone else. As if I was some random person who had wandered uninvited into their celebration. rather than the woman who had given him life and spent 36 years loving him unconditionally. "I see," I said, and something in my tone must have surprised him because there was a pause before he continued. "Mom, don't make this into something it's not. We love you, but we need space to live our own lives without feeling like we have to manage everyone's expectations all the time." Manage everyone's expectations? There it was, the truth he probably hadn't meant to reveal. I wasn't a beloved family member whose presence brought joy and connection. I was an expectation that needed to be managed, a burden that required careful handling, a problem that took energy away from their real priorities. "Thank you for clarifying that, Mark," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "I think I understand the situation much better now." I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of my own delusions, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I began to see my situation with perfect, painful clarity. The woman who had driven to that anniversary party hoping to repair relationships with love and memories was gone. In her place was someone I hadn't met in a very long time, a woman who was finally ready to stop accepting the unacceptable. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I did something I'd been avoiding for years. I sat down with a notebook and a pen, and I forced myself to document the evidence. Not the excuses I'd been making, not the rationalizations I'd been clinging to, but the actual facts of what my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law had become. My grandchildren. This was where the erosion had been most carefully orchestrated, because it was the hardest to protest without sounding selfish or demanding. I opened my calendar and counted backwards. When was the last time I'd had Emma and James for an overnight visit? 8 months ago. When was the last time I'd been invited to a school event? Emma's spring concert in May, but I'd only found out about it when I called to ask how it went. The visits had become supervised theater performances. I wasn't allowed to simply be a grandmother. I had to be a grandmother under Sarah's direction. "Please don't give them sugar before dinner time, Margaret. We're trying to limit screen time, so maybe skip the cartoons today. They're not allowed to play in the basement anymore. We've decided it's not safe." But the rules weren't really about the children's soft moments. They were about establishing who was in charge, who made the decisions, whose authority mattered. Sarah wasn't protecting her children from danger. She was protecting them from the influence of a grandmother whose methods didn't align with her vision of perfect parenting. I wrote down the conversations I'd had with Emma and James during their last visit, and I realized something that made my chest tighten with grief. These children barely knew me anymore. Emma, at 8 years old, was polite but distant, like she was visiting an elderly neighbor rather than her grandmother. James, only 5, seemed almost shy around me. This boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. The financial ledger. This part required me to do something I'd been deliberately avoiding. I pulled out my bank statements and started adding up the numbers. The loan for their honeymoon to Italy, $4,000, never mentioned again. The down payment help for Sarah's car, $8,000, supposedly to be paid back when things got less tight. The countless grocery trips where I'd happened to be at the store anyway and picked up everything they needed for the week. The children's Christmas presents that I bought because money was tight this year. The emergency furnace repair I'd paid for because they just didn't have that kind of cash lying around. The credit card bill I'd helped with when Sarah decided to redecorate their living room because it was important for Mark's career to have a home suitable for entertaining clients. At least $17,000 over 5 years, $17,000 in loans and help in emergencies. Never acknowledged as the sacrifices they were, never appreciated as the gifts they became, never even mentioned in conversation unless I was the one to bring them up, and when I did mention them, I was made to feel petty and money-grubbing, as if love should be measured by how gracefully you could be forgotten. But it wasn't really about the money, it was about what the money represented. My desperate attempts to purchase belonging, to earn my place in their lives through usefulness rather than love. I had confused being needed with being valued, and they had been happy to let me continue in that confusion as long as the benefits kept flowing their way. The erasure, This was the most insidious layer because it had happened so gradually I almost hadn't noticed it. I started thinking about family stories, the narratives that define who we are and where we come from. Somewhere along the way, I had been edited out of Mark's origin story. At family gatherings, when people asked about Mark's childhood, Sarah had begun telling the stories. But in her versions, I was either absent entirely or reduced to a supporting character in someone else's drama. The camping trip where Mark learned to fish became a story about his father's patience and outdoor skills. Never mind that his father had worked every weekend, and I was the one who taught Mark to bait a hook. The year Mark broke his arm and I slept on the hospital floor because he was scared and couldn't sleep without me there, that story never got told at all. The countless sick days when I held him while he fought fevers, the homework battles we worked through together, the bedtime stories I made up just for him, all of that had been quietly erased from the official family mythology. In Sarah's version of events, Mark had emerged, fully formed, as the wonderful man he was today, shaped primarily by his own character and her loving influence. I had become a footnote in my own son's story, mentioned only when context required acknowledgement of my existence. Even my opinions about the grandchildren had been systematically dismissed. When I suggested that Emma might benefit from art classes because she'd always loved drawing, Sarah explained that experts now recommend focusing on STEM skills for girls. When I worried that James seemed unusually anxious and might benefit from talking to someone, I was told that some children are just sensitive and that I was probably overreacting. I wasn't allowed to have insights about children I'd helped raise because, in Sarah's worldview, modern parenting knowledge superseded the irrelevant experience of previous generations. My decades of motherhood, my success in raising a son she'd chosen to marry, my instincts about children, none of that mattered compared to whatever she'd read in the latest parenting blog. Mark's complicity. This was the most devastating layer, because it forced me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding most desperately. My son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed for, the person I loved most in the world, was not an innocent bystander in my systematic exclusion. He was an active participant. I'd thought about all the times he'd stood silently while Sarah made her cutting comments about my outdated ways. I remembered the conversations where he'd quietly agreed that I was too involved or too demanding or too sensitive about family matters. I counted the phone calls where he'd chosen to share Sarah's perspective rather than defend my feelings. The man who used to call me every Sunday had gradually stopped calling at all. The son who used to ask my advice about everything from job decisions to home repairs had learned to make those decisions without consulting the woman who'd guided him through the first 25 years of his life. But most painfully, I realized that Mark had never once stood up for me when Sarah criticized or dismissed me. Not once, in 5 years of marriage, he had never said, "That's my mother you're talking about," or "She raised me pretty well," or even, "Maybe we should include her in this decision." Sitting there in my kitchen at 3 a.m, surrounded by pages of evidence I could no longer ignore, I finally understood what had really happened. This wasn't a case of unfortunate miscommunication or gradual drift. This was a systematic campaign to remove me from their lives while maintaining access to my resources. They didn't want my presence, they wanted my presence. They didn't want my love, they wanted my labor. They didn't want my wisdom, they wanted my wallet. And most devastatingly of all, they had succeeded in making me complicit in my own erasure. I had accepted less and less while giving more and more, convincing myself that this was what mature love looked like, that this was how modern families functioned. But sitting there with my notebook full of evidence, I finally understood the difference between being loved and being useful, and I realized that for the first time in years, I had a choice to make about which one I was willing to accept. The woman who had spent 5 years making excuses for their behavior was done making excuses. It was time to start making changes. At 4:30 in the morning, after documenting years of systematic dismissal, I did something that surprised even me. I walked to my desk, pulled out a fresh piece of paper, and wrote a single sentence in my clearest handwriting. I am no longer a bank, a babysitter, or a burden. I carried that piece of paper to my bathroom and taped it to the mirror, where I would see it every morning when I brushed my teeth. Not hidden in a drawer where I could forget about it, not tucked into a book where it would become theoretical. Right there, on my mirror, where it would force me to look at both my reflection and my resolution at the same time. Those 11 words became my manifesto, my declaration of independence from a relationship that had been slowly poisoning me for years. I read them out loud, testing how they felt in my mouth, how they sounded in the morning silence of my bathroom. They felt like truth. They felt like freedom. The phone rang at 8:15 that Sunday morning, jolting me from the first deep sleep I'd had in weeks. Mark's name on the caller ID no longer made my heart leap with hope. It made my stomach clench with the certainty that this call would not be an apology. He said, and I could hear the careful restraint in his voice, the tone of someone who'd been coached on how to handle a difficult conversation. Sarah's really upset about last night. She feels like you put her in an impossible position. An impossible position. The woman who had rejected me at her own front door was now the victim of my unreasonable expectations. The woman who had taken my gift and told me I wasn't wanted was somehow the injured party in this scenario. I see, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. And what position would that be exactly? You know Sarah doesn't like conflict. When you showed up without confirming you were still invited, it put her in the awkward spot of having to address the situation in front of everyone. Without confirming I was still invited. To my son's anniversary party. The invitation I'd received in the mail, addressed formally, with no mention that my attendance was conditional or required verification. Mark, I said, looking at myself in the bathroom mirror where my resolution was taped. I received an invitation. I brought a gift. I arrived at the designated time. In what universe does that constitute showing up without confirmation? There was a pause, the kind of pause that happens when someone realizes their prepared script isn't working and they need to improvise. Mom, you know what I mean. Things have been tense lately. You can't just pretend everything is fine when we've been trying to establish some boundaries. How many boundaries would those be? The boundary where I give you money but don't expect acknowledgement? The boundary where I provide childcare but don't get to have opinions about my grandchildren? The boundary where I'm supposed to read your minds about when I'm welcome and when I'm not? That's not, Mom, you're being dramatic. We love you, but we need space to build our own family traditions without feeling like we have to manage everyone's feelings all the time. There it was again, manage everyone's feelings. I wasn't a person whose emotions mattered. I was a problem that required management. My hurt feelings weren't valid concerns that deserved attention. They were inconveniences that interfered with their comfort. You're absolutely right, Mark, I said, and I could hear the surprise in his silence. He'd been prepared for tears, for argument, for the usual maternal guilt that would make him feel bad enough to throw me a few crumbs of attention. You are? Yes, I am. You shouldn't have to manage my feelings. You shouldn't have to worry about including me in your family traditions. You shouldn't have to consider my reactions when you make decisions about your life. Well, good. I'm glad you understand. And I shouldn't have to beg for basic respect from my own son. I shouldn't have to pay for the privilege of loving my grandchildren. I shouldn't have to pretend that being treated like an obligation feels like being loved. Another pause. Longer this time. Marie say, "What are you saying, Mom?" I'm saying that you're right. You need space to build your family traditions without managing my feelings. So, I'm giving you that space. All of it. What does that mean? It means I won't be available for babysitting anymore. Not this weekend, not next weekend, not ever again. It means I won't be offering financial assistance for emergencies or non-emergencies or anything in between. It means I won't be showing up to events where my presence requires management. Mom, you're overreacting. No, Mark, I'm reacting appropriately. For the first time in years, I'm responding to how I'm actually being treated, instead of how I wish I were being treated. But you don't need me, Mark. You've made that very clear. What you need is my services, my money, my time, my labor, my compliance. But you don't need me as a person, as a mother, as a grandmother, as someone whose feelings and opinions and presence might actually add value to your life. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, probably trying to figure out how to get the useful parts of me back without having to deal with the inconvenient parts. My feelings, my expectations, my humanity. Family helps family. That's how this works. You can't just stop being there for us because your feelings got hurt. Family helps family, I repeated, letting the words sit in the silence between us. You're absolutely right. Family does help family. Family also includes family. Family celebrates together, grieves together, makes decisions together. Family doesn't systematically erase each other from photographs and traditions and holiday tables. We haven't erased you. Last night, you erased me from your anniversary celebration, but that was just the latest in a long series of erasures. I'm simply accepting your decision and making it easier for everyone involved. People decision? The decision to have a family that doesn't include me as anything more than a resource to be tapped when convenient, I respect that decision, Mark. I'm just no longer willing to participate in it. He tried several more approaches: guilt, minimization, blame shifting, even a few tears. He told me I was being petty, holding grudges, overreacting to something that wasn't a big deal. He accused me of abandoning my responsibilities as a mother and grandmother. But I had found something during that long night of truth-telling: self-respect. And self-respect, I'd learned, was not negotiable. Mark, I said finally, when he'd exhausted his arsenal of manipulation tactics. Last night, you and your wife made a choice. You chose to exclude me from your celebration, your traditions, your family life. You made that choice consciously and deliberately. I have made a choice too. I choose to stop begging for acceptance from people who have already decided I'm not worth accepting. I choose to stop giving my time and energy and love to people who see it as an obligation rather than a gift. I choose to stop measuring my worth by whether or not you want me around. But, Mom, I'm not angry, Mark. I'm not punishing you. I'm simply responding to the information you've given me about where I stand in your life, and I'm choosing to stand somewhere else. Somewhere I'm actually wanted. When I hung up that phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the peace of surrender, but the peace of finally stopping a fight I could never win. I walked back to my bathroom mirror and read my resolution one more time. I am no longer a bank, a babysitter, or a burden. For the first time in my life, I meant it. The silence in my house after that phone call with Mark wasn't the hollow emptiness I'd expected. It was full of possibility. For the first time in years, my day belonged entirely to me. No anxious waiting for phone calls that might not come. No checking my calendar to keep time available for emergencies that would require my services. No mental energy spent trying to decode whether I was welcome or merely tolerated. I made myself a proper breakfast, not the hurried toast I usually grabbed while worrying about their problems, and sat at my kitchen table with the Sunday newspaper spread out in front of me, and there, in the community section, was an advertisement that caught my eye like a beacon. Pottery classes for beginners, Tuesdays at 10 a.m. All skill levels welcome. Pottery. When was the last time I'd created something with my hands just for the joy of creation? When was the last time I'd learned something new just because it interested me? I couldn't remember. For years, my time had been divided between maintaining my household and being available for whatever crisis or convenience might require my attention. I called the number that morning and spoke to a woman named Helen who had the warmest laugh I'd heard in months. "Oh, we'd love to have you join us," she said. "There's something magical about working with clay. It's impossible to worry about anything else when your hands are covered in mud and you're trying to center a pot." Tuesday used to be the day I kept free in case Sarah needed help with the children's activities or Mark needed assistance with some household project. Now, it was going to be my day, my clay, my creation, my choice. The pottery class was just the beginning. Within 2 weeks, I'd also signed up for a book club at the library, something I'd wanted to do for years but never had time for because I was always on standby for their needs. I started taking morning walks in the park, joined a group of women who met for coffee after their exercise routines, and even signed up for a cooking class focused on cuisines I'd never tried. My house began to feel different. Instead of a museum of rejected love and anticipatory anxiety, it started feeling like a home again. My home. I rearranged the furniture to suit my preferences instead of keeping everything positioned for visits that rarely came and were barely tolerated when they did. I bought books that interested me, plants that made me happy, and art that spoke to my soul without consulting anyone else's taste or opinion. The pottery class turned out to be everything Helen had promised. There's something profoundly therapeutic about working with clay, the way it responds to pressure, the way it can be reshaped when it goes wrong, the way each piece emerges as something entirely unique. My first attempts were laughably lopsided, but Helen and the other women cheered every small success like I'd created a masterpiece. "You have natural instincts for this," Helen told me after my third class, when I'd managed to create a bowl that was almost round and only slightly uneven. "There's something about the way you approach the clay, patient but decisive. You should consider taking the intermediate class." Patient but decisive. When was the last time someone had described me in terms that suggested strength rather than convenience? When was the last time my approach to anything had been praised rather than tolerated or managed? But the most surprising gift came from a source I never anticipated. 3 weeks after my Declaration of Independence, my phone chimed with a text message on a Thursday evening. When I looked at the screen, I saw a number I didn't recognize, but the message made my heart stop. "Hi, Grandma Margaret, it's Liam. Is it okay if I text you sometimes?" Liam. My grandson. Not James, as I'd been calling him in my pain-addled state. Liam, who was 8 years old and somehow had gotten hold of a phone or convinced someone to let him use theirs. Liam, who had reached out to me when I thought all connection with my grandchildren had been severed. I stared at that message for a full minute, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. The old me would have immediately called Mark to ask permission, would have worried about overstepping boundaries or causing more conflict. But the new me, the woman who had learned to value her own worth, understood something crucial. This child was reaching out for connection, and real love doesn't require permission. "Hi, sweetheart," I texted back. "I would love to hear from you anytime you want to reach out. I love you very much." His response came immediately. "I love you too, Grandma. I miss talking to you. Can you send me a sunflower emoji? They're my favorite." A sunflower emoji. Such a simple request, but it felt like the most important communication I'd received in years. I sent him the brightest, happiest sunflower I could find, followed by a heart. He sent back 3 sunflowers and a smiley face. Over the following weeks, Liam and I developed a quiet text relationship that existed entirely separate from the conflict with his parents. We didn't talk about the drama, or the hurt feelings, or the complicated adult emotions that had created this rift. We talked about his school projects, his favorite books, the funny things his teacher said. I told him about my pottery class, about the crooked bowls I was learning to make, about the park where I walked in the mornings. These conversations were precious precisely because they were authentic. I wasn't performing the role of grandmother under Sarah's supervision or trying to prove my worth through usefulness. I was simply being present for a child who wanted to connect with me, offering love without expecting anything in return except the joy of genuine relationship. I was careful never to put Liam in the middle of the adult conflict. When he mentioned that his parents seemed stressed or that there was tension at home, I simply validated his feelings without adding my own perspective or asking for information. "Sometimes adults have disagreements that don't have anything to do with kids," I would tell him. The important thing is that you know you're loved by everyone, even when the grown-ups are working through their own problems. My pottery classmates began inviting me to other activities: gallery openings, wine tastings, book discussions. Helen, who had become a real friend, introduced me to her hiking group. "You have such an interesting perspective on things," she told me one Tuesday after class. "You should consider leading a discussion group about women reinventing themselves later in life. There are so many of us who would benefit from hearing your story." The idea would have terrified the old me. What if I wasn't qualified? What if people didn't want to hear what I had to say? What if I failed? But the new me, the one who had stopped measuring her worth by other people's approval, found the idea exciting rather than frightening. "I think I'd like that," I told her, and I meant it. This is what happens when you stop pouring all your energy into relationships that drain you. You discover you have more to give than you ever imagined. You find people who appreciate what you offer instead of taking it for granted. You remember that you're worth more than whatever scraps others are willing to throw your way. My house, which had felt so empty after years of being a way station for other people's needs, began to fill with the warmth of my own fully lived life. The kitchen where I'd once waited anxiously for phone calls became the place where I planned pottery projects and tried new recipes. The living room where I'd once sat on standby for emergencies became my reading nook, where I could lose myself in books for hours without guilt or interruption. And most importantly, I realized that the love I'd been trying so desperately to earn from people who didn't want it already existed. It just needed to be redirected toward people who did. Helen and my pottery classmates, who valued my insights and enjoyed my company. Liam, who cherished our secret sunflower exchanges. The woman at the coffee shop who remembered my order and always asked about my latest ceramic creation. I had spent years believing that my worth was measured by how much Mark and Sarah needed me, but I was learning something revolutionary. My worth was actually measured by how much I was willing to value myself. And for the first time in years, the answer to that question was finally enough. It was a Thursday morning, exactly 6 weeks after the anniversary incident, when Mark showed up at my door. I was in my pottery studio, the spare bedroom I'd converted into my creative space, working on a set of bowls for Helen's birthday, my hands deep in clay and my mind peacefully focused on the rhythm of the wheel. Through my front window, I could see him pacing on my porch like a caged animal, his jaw set in that stubborn line I remembered from his teenage years when he didn't get his way. But I wasn't the same woman who used to drop everything and rush to soothe his frustrations. I finished shaping the rim of my bowl, cleaned my hands thoroughly, and only then went to answer the door. The man standing on my porch looked like my son, but something fundamental had shifted in how I saw him. Instead of the boy I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, I saw a grown man who had driven 20 minutes across town to yell at his mother for having the audacity to value herself. "What the hell is going on, Mom?" he demanded, pushing past me into my living room without waiting for an invitation. His eyes swept over the changes I'd made, the rearranged furniture, the pottery pieces displayed on new shelves, the books stacked everywhere, the evidence of a life being lived for its own sake. "Good morning to you too, Mark," I said, closing the door quietly and turning to face him. He was wound tight with the kind of frustrated energy that comes from having your manipulation tactics suddenly stop working. "Don't give me that calm act, Mom. First you cause a scene at our anniversary, then you cut us off completely, and now Liam is asking weird questions about whether Grandma is okay? What are you trying to prove here?" I leaned against my doorframe and really looked at this man. My son, who had just reframed every single element of our situation to cast himself as the victim. The rejected anniversary gift had become me causing a scene. My decision to stop accepting unacceptable treatment had become me cutting them off. And my grandson's natural concern for his grandmother had somehow become my fault for existing in a way that worried him. "I'm not trying to prove anything, Mark. I'm simply living my life according to the boundaries you and Sarah established." Bing. What boundaries? Mom, you're being completely unreasonable about this whole thing. It was one party. You can't just cut us off because of one misunderstanding. One misunderstanding. 6 weeks of me building a life that didn't revolve around their needs. 6 weeks of me discovering what self-respect felt like. 6 weeks of me actually being happy, and he had reduced it all to a tantrum over one misunderstanding? Ugh. Mark, let me be very clear about something. I am not cutting you off. I am simply respecting the boundaries you established when your wife told me I wasn't welcome at your celebration. That's not what she meant. That's exactly what she meant, I interrupted, my voice still unnervingly calm. And it's exactly what you meant when you stood behind her and said nothing while she dismissed me from your doorstep. I watched his face cycle through confusion, irritation, and something that looked almost like panic as he realized his usual tactics weren't working. The mother who used to apologize for having feelings, who used to beg for scraps of his attention, who used to make herself smaller to accommodate his comfort, that woman was gone. Mom, we never said we didn't want you in our lives. You're being dramatic. No, Mark. I'm being honest. For the first time in years, I'm being completely honest about what's been happening in our relationship. And the truth is that you and your wife decided long ago that I was a burden you had to manage rather than a person you wanted to celebrate. That's not true. It is true. The gradually decreased phone calls, the supervised visits with my grandchildren, the exclusion from family events, the way Sarah rewrites our family history while you sit silent. The anniversary party was just the first time someone bothered to say it out loud. I could see him struggling to find a response that would make me the unreasonable one, the difficult one, the one who needed to apologize and beg for forgiveness. But I wasn't giving him that opening anymore. Mom, family helps family. That's how this works. You can't just stop. Stop what, Mark? Stop providing free childcare? Stop giving you money you never pay back? Stop accepting treatment from you that I wouldn't tolerate from a stranger? It's not like that. We appreciate everything you've done. No, you don't. You expect it. There's a difference between appreciation and expectation, and you crossed that line years ago. Mark tried several more approaches: guilt, minimization, blame shifting, even a few tears. He told me I was being petty, holding grudges, overreacting to something that wasn't a big deal. He accused me of turning Liam against them, of being selfish, of abandoning my responsibilities as a mother and grandmother. Mark, I said finally, when he'd exhausted his arsenal of manipulation tactics, you keep talking about responsibilities. Let me ask you something. What responsibilities do you think you have toward me? He opened his mouth and then closed it, clearly not having expected that question. I mean it, Mark. What do you think a son owes his mother? What does family helping family look like when it flows in my direction? The silence stretched between us, and I could see him realizing that in all his arguments about my obligations to him, he had never once considered what his obligations to me might be. That's what I thought. You want me to act like family towards you while you treat me like a service provider. You want me to love you unconditionally while you love me conditionally, conditional on my usefulness, my compliance, my willingness to accept whatever crumbs of attention you're willing to throw my way. But Mom, I am 67 years old, Mark. I have spent the last 5 years of my life trying to earn something from you that should have been freely given. I have sacrificed my time, my money, my dignity, and my peace of mind trying to purchase belonging in my own family. I'm done purchasing what should have been mine by right. I'm done accepting the unacceptable. I'm done pretending that being used feels like being loved. So here's what's going to happen. You and Sarah are going to continue living your beautiful life with your beautiful house and your beautiful children. You're going to find other people to provide the services I used to provide because I am no longer available for employment in my own family. And I am going to continue building a life that makes me happy, surrounded by people who value my presence instead of just my presence. Mark stood there for a long moment, looking like he wanted to argue more, but finally understanding that the woman who used to absorb his anger and apologize for her own hurt was never coming back. The mother who had taught him he could treat people badly and they'd still love him unconditionally had learned to love herself conditionally instead. He left without another word, and I closed the door behind him with the same calm finality I'd been denied 6 weeks earlier. But this time, I was the one walking away from something that no longer served me. I went back to my pottery studio, washed my hands, and returned to my work. The clay was still wet, still moldable, still full of possibility, just like my life. And for the first time in years, that felt like exactly the right place to be. It's been 7 months since Mark stormed out of my house. 7 months since I stopped accepting the unacceptable. And I want to tell you what my life looks like now, because it's nothing like what I feared it would be when I first made the decision to choose myself over their comfort. I'm sitting in my pottery studio right now, the spare bedroom that used to collect dust while I waited for grandchildren who rarely visited. The shelves are lined with bowls and mugs and vases I've created with my own hands, each one imperfect and beautiful and entirely mine. The latest piece, a large serving platter, is drying on the wheel. I made it for the dinner party I'm hosting next week for my pottery class friends. My Tuesdays are still reserved for pottery, but now I'm helping Helen teach the beginner classes. "You have such a gift for encouragement," she told me last month. "The way you help new students see possibility instead of failure? It's exactly what this class needs." I've become what the younger women call a pottery grandmother, the kind of mentor who believes in people's potential even when they can't see it themselves. Last month, I started that discussion group Helen had suggested, Reinventing Yourself at Any Age. We meet every other Thursday evening, and our little group has grown from 4 women to 12. We talk about finding courage after disappointment, building lives that reflect our values instead of other people's expectations, learning to value ourselves regardless of who else does or doesn't. Liam still texts me every Tuesday evening. We call it Sunflower Tuesday now. Our conversations have become the lighthouse of my week, not because I'm using them to get information about Mark and Sarah, but because my grandson has become a real person to me instead of just a symbol of what I'd lost. He's 9 now, navigating 4th grade with all its complexities, and he tells me things that matter to him. His favorite books, his thoughts about friendship, his worries about tests, and his excitement about science projects. I listen without trying to fix anything, validate his experiences without offering unsolicited advice, love him without expecting anything in return except the joy of genuine connection. Last month, he asked me something that made me realize how much I'd changed. "Grandma Margaret, you always sound happy now. Even when I tell you sad things, you sound like you're okay. How do you do that?" And I realized I knew the answer to that question, not from a book or a movie or wishful thinking, but from lived experience. "Sweet boy," I told him, "I learned the difference between being sad about something and being sad about everything. When you know who you are and what you're worth, other people's choices can make you sad, but they can't make you feel worthless. I can be sad that your dad and I don't talk anymore without feeling like I'm a bad person. I can miss you and Emma without thinking I deserve to be punished. I can feel disappointed about how things turned out without believing that I caused it all by being too much or not enough. The secret, Liam, is learning that your worth doesn't depend on how other people treat you. It depends on how you treat yourself." I could hear him thinking about that, processing it in the way that children do when they're given truth instead of platitudes. Mark and Sarah still live across town. They still have their beautiful house, their successful careers, their carefully curated life. They've found other people to provide the services I used to offer. A babysitter for the children, loans from Sarah's parents, help with household projects from Mark's colleagues. Their life continued just fine without me, which was exactly the proof I needed that I had been right to step away. I'm not angry anymore. Anger was just the bridge I had to cross to get to something better. Self-respect. I don't wish them ill. I simply wish them well from a distance because they've made it clear that distance is what they prefer. You know what I've learned in these 7 months? The energy I was spending trying to earn love from people who didn't want to give it was enormous. I had no idea how much of my life force was being drained by the constant anxiety of wondering if I was enough, doing enough, giving enough to deserve basic kindness and inclusion. Now that energy goes toward people who appreciate what I have to offer. My pottery students who benefit from my encouragement and patience, my discussion group members who value my insights about resilience and reinvention, Helen and my other friends who enjoy my company without seeing it as a burden to be managed. If you're watching this and recognizing yourself in my story, if you're the one always giving, always accommodating, always making excuses for people who treat your love like an inconvenience, let this be your permission slip. You don't have to keep standing on doorsteps holding gifts for people who see you as a burden. You don't have to keep offering your heart to people who hand it back unwrapped. You don't have to keep explaining why you deserve basic kindness and inclusion from the people who claim to love you. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for them and for yourself, is to stop. Stop trying to earn what should be freely given. Stop accepting crumbs when you deserve the whole feast. Stop making yourself smaller so other people can feel bigger. Take that love, that care, that incredible capacity for nurturing and devotion, and bring it home to yourself. Find people who celebrate your gifts instead of taking them for granted. Discover what it feels like to be valued instead of tolerated, appreciated instead of managed, included instead of endured. This is what the other side looks like. It's not bitter or lonely or sad, even though that's what I was afraid it would be. It's peaceful and purposeful and full of genuine connection with people who actually want what you have to offer. It's Tuesday evening text conversations with a grandson who trusts you with his real thoughts. It's Thursday pottery classes where your encouragement helps someone create something beautiful. It's Saturday morning coffee with friends who hang on your every word because they value your perspective. Most of all, it's the deep satisfaction of knowing that you're worth celebrating, even if, especially if, you have to be the one to light the candles. This mug is crooked, the handle is slightly uneven, and the glaze didn't turn out quite the color I expected. But it holds my morning coffee perfectly, it fits my hands just right, and every time I use it, I remember that I created something beautiful with my own hands for my own pleasure. I'm 71 years old, and I'm just now learning that imperfect things can be perfect for the people who love them. I'm just now discovering that the person whose approval I needed most was the one looking back at me in the mirror. So if you enjoyed this story about finding the courage to value yourself as much as you value others, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are so many of us learning to light our own candles, and we need to know we're not alone in choosing ourselves for once. The clay is calling. I have a new vase to finish, and for the first time in my life, so am I. Welcome to the other side. The water's fine, and there's plenty of room for everyone who's ready to come home to themselves. The best pottery, they say, comes from the pieces that crack in the kiln and get put back together with gold. Turns out, the same is true for people.